Shaq was minding his own business at a gas station when he saw a struggling mother counting pennies to fill her tank. Her son, watching from the back seat, whispered, "Mommy, are we going home?" Before she could answer, a man in a luxury car sneered, "If you're that broke, maybe you don't belong here." The station went silent. People stared. Cameras rolled. But instead of arguing, Shaq smiled, because he had a plan. What he did next exposed a billionaire's darkest secrets, destroyed a corrupt empire, and turned humiliation into the ultimate revenge. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The gas pump clicked, signaling an empty tank. Emily's breath hitched as she gripped the pump handle, staring at the screen flashing $0.00. Her hands trembled as she reached into her purse, fingers sifting through loose change and crumpled bills. She knew the answer before she even counted. It wasn't enough. From the back seat, a small voice broke the silence. "Mommy, are we going home now?" Emily blinked back the sting in her eyes and forced a smile as she turned to her son, Oliver, his round face illuminated by the dim gas station lights. His brown eyes, wide with hope, made it even harder to hide the truth. "Almost, baby," she whispered, swallowing the lump in her throat. Her fingers fumbled as she pulled out her debit card, her last shot. With a deep breath, she swiped. Declined. Her heart sank. She tried again, forcing a hopeful prayer under her breath. Declined. A wave of panic spread through her chest, threatening to suffocate her. This wasn't just about gas. It was about getting Oliver home safely, about not making him feel like they were trapped in a nightmare of bad luck and hard times. As she dug frantically through her bag, trying to piece together enough for at least a gallon, she didn't notice the massive shadow falling over her. "You good, ma'am?" The deep, rumbling voice made her freeze. Slowly she turned. Standing next to her, towering like a wall of muscle, was a man she immediately recognized, Shaquille O'Neal. Even in a simple hoodie and sweatpants, he was impossible to mistake. Emily's face burned with embarrassment. Of all the people to witness this moment, it had to be him. She quickly shoved the coins back into her purse, forcing a shaky smile. I'll be fine," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But Shaq wasn't convinced. His dark eyes studied her, taking in the stress lines on her face, the tired slump of her shoulders. He glanced at Oliver in the back seat, the little boy staring up at him in awe. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The gas station was quiet except for the hum of a flickering neon light and the distant sound of a car speeding past on the empty highway. Then, without another word, Shaq reached into his pocket. Emily's eyes widened as he pulled out his wallet, thick with crisp bills. Her stomach clenched. Oh no. Emily's pride screamed at her to refuse, but before she could protest, Shaq stepped forward, slipping his card into the pump. Emily's breath hitched as she saw the thick stack of bills in Shaq's massive hand. Her stomach twisted with embarrassment, and before she could think, she shook her head violently. "No," she blurted out, stepping back. "I can't take that." Shaq raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. He didn't look offended. If anything, he looked amused, like he had seen this reaction before. "It ain't charity," he said, his deep voice calm but firm. "It's just one human helping another." Emily's throat tightened. She knew he meant well, but accepting help from a stranger, especially one as famous as Shaq, felt like surrendering. She had spent months scraping by, holding herself together for Oliver. Taking money from someone, no matter how kind the gesture, made her feel weak. "I appreciate it," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "But I—" Before she could finish, Shaq moved. With a smooth, effortless motion, he slid his card into the pump and pressed the button to start fueling her car. The gas meter blinked to life, and the sound of fuel rushing into the empty tank filled the silent night. Emily blinked. "Wait." Shaq held up a hand. "It's already done." She opened her mouth to protest but closed it just as fast. What could she say? The pump was running, and stopping it now would be pointless. Her hands shook as she wiped at the tears threatening to spill. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Shaq shrugged, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Because I can." A small gasp came from the back seat. "Mommy!" Oliver's voice was full of excitement. "That's the basketball guy." Shaq chuckled, glancing at the little boy whose face was now pressed up against the window. Oliver's wide brown eyes shone with recognition, his tiny hands smudging the glass. Emily let out a watery laugh, brushing her hair back. Yeah, baby, that's Shaquille O'Neal. Oliver's face lit up. You're huge, Shaq grinned. So I've been told. For the first time that night, Emily felt some of the weight on her shoulders lift. Just a little. Just enough to breathe. But then, beep! A sharp honk shattered the moment. Emily and Shaq both turned as a sleek, black luxury car rolled into the station, its headlights casting an almost blinding glow. The driver revved the engine before jerking to a stop near the pump. As the door swung open, a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, his face twisted in irritation. His cold, sharp eyes locked onto Emily's rusted car, then flicked toward Shaq. The disgust was immediate. What the hell is this? The man sneered. Emily stiffened. Something about this man, his presence, his tone, sent a shiver down her spine. The man in the expensive car stepped forward, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the pavement, his tailored suit pristine despite the grimy surroundings of the gas station. He took one look at Emily's rusted, dented sedan and scoffed like the sight of it physically offended him. Wow, he muttered, shaking his head. This is pathetic. Emily felt her stomach drop. She knew people like him, men who had never struggled a day in their lives, who looked at people like her as if they were less than. She instinctively stepped back, shielding Oliver from view as if that would protect him from the man's cruel words. The man turned his gaze to Shaq, his lip curling in amusement. And you, he said, motioning toward the gas pump. What are you doing wasting your money on people like that? The phrase hit Emily like a slap. People like that, like she wasn't even a person, just some invisible figure taking up space in a world that didn't want her. Her face burned with shame. She wanted to disappear. Shaq, however, didn't flinch. His broad shoulders squared as he stared at the man, his expression calm but unreadable. People like what? Shaq asked, his voice low, controlled. The man smirked. Come on, big guy. We both know how this goes. You help her out today, she'll be right back here next week, asking for more. Some people don't want to help themselves. He turned back to Emily, looking her up and down like she was a piece of garbage someone had forgotten to throw away. Or am I wrong? Emily's hands curled into fists. Shaq exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, like a lion deciding whether or not to pounce. You must be real brave to talk like that, Shaq said, his voice suddenly quieter, but somehow heavier. The tension thickened, stretching between them like an unspoken challenge. For the first time, the man hesitated. Emily swallowed hard. She had seen this kind of confrontation before, when men with too much power were forced to stand face to face with someone who wouldn't cower to them. The man's jaw tightened, but he quickly covered it up with a scoff. Relax, he said, throwing up his hands. Just saying what everyone else is thinking. Shaq's jaw ticked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Let me show you something, man. The man rolled his eyes. Oh, great. Are you about to flex your bank account? Try to prove a point? Look, we all know you're rich, Shaq, but... Shaq tapped his screen, scrolled for a second, then turned the phone around. Whatever was on the screen made the man's smug expression vanish instantly. The color drained from his face. Emily frowned, confused. What is it? She asked softly. Shaq kept his eyes locked on the man. Ask him, Shaq said. The man took a shaky step back, his confidence suddenly gone. Bradley leaned in, still wearing that smug grin, expecting to see something flashy. Maybe Shaq's net worth, $1 million investment, or some high-profile endorsement deal. He thought this was about flexing money, about proving status. But when his eyes landed on the phone screen, all the arrogance drained from his face. His smirk twitched, faltered, his skin paled. Shaq tilted the phone slightly, ensuring the glowing screen caught the dim gas station light. A bold headline stood out in stark black letters against a white news background. Whitmore Enterprises under federal investigation for fraud. Silence fell over the gas station. Even the faint hum of a nearby car radio seemed to fade into the background. The smirk was long gone now. Bradley's lips parted slightly, his pupils dilating. He let out a nervous chuckle, but it sounded forced, hollow. Where'd you get that? He muttered, his voice suddenly hoarse. Shaq didn't answer. He didn't need to. From behind the counter, the gas station attendant, a young man in his 20s, let out a low whistle. He had been watching the exchange from the start, but now as recognition dawned on his face, he leaned forward, eyes wide. Wait a minute, the attendant said, pointing a cautious finger at Bradley. Aren't you that guy who fired a bunch of employees last month? My cousin worked for your company. Said you laid off like 100 people overnight. No severance, no nothing. Shaq raised an eyebrow. That true, Brad? Bradley's nostrils flared. His jaw tightened. That's business, he spat, trying to recover. Companies restructure all the time. Emily hadn't spoken in a while. She had been standing frozen, clutching Oliver's tiny hand, trying to process everything happening in front of her. But at that moment, when the gas station attendant connected the dots, when Shaq turned the phone screen toward her, when the name Whitmore Enterprises hit her ears, it all clicked. She sucked in a sharp breath. No, she whispered. Bradley barely spared her a glance. Emily's knees felt weak. The air seemed to vanish from her lungs. The world around her blurred for a second. Her late husband, Daniel. He had worked for Whitmore Enterprises. He had been one of those laid-off employees. One of the men Bradley Whitmore had tossed aside like trash. Her fingers curled into fists. She had spent months watching Daniel struggle after losing his job. She had seen the light in his eyes dim, had heard the late-night conversations where he whispered to himself, desperate to figure out how he'd provide for their family. And then came the accident. The night he had been driving home from yet another failed job interview, exhausted, distracted, her vision blurred with unshed tears. You! Her voice was barely audible, but the anger behind it burned hotter than fire. Bradley finally turned to her, frowning, as if just now realizing she was still there. Emily's hands began to tremble. She looked at him, not as a rich man in an expensive suit, not as some arrogant businessman who threw insults around like confetti, but as the man who had ruined her husband's life. Her voice cracked as she finally spoke. You killed my husband. Bradley's back hit the side of his car as if he had been physically struck by Emily's words. For the first time that night, his arrogance faltered. His gaze darted between her and Shaq, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. I didn't know, he stammered. This is a misunderstanding. Emily's eyes burned with fury, her hands trembling at her sides. A misunderstanding? Her voice cracked, but there was steel beneath it. You fired my husband like he was nothing. No warning, no severance. He gave everything to your company, his time, his loyalty, his sanity, and you took it all away without a second thought. Bradley's lips pressed into a thin line. He adjusted the cuff of his designer suit, as if trying to reassemble his crumbling composure. It was a corporate decision. Budget cuts. It wasn't personal. Not personal? Emily's voice rose. Her body shook, her breath coming in shallow gasps. My husband died because of what you did. He was out there searching for work, desperate, exhausted, because you ripped our security away. Shaq, silent until now, took a step closer. His towering frame cast a heavy shadow over Bradley, his eyes locked onto the businessman with quiet intensity. You're real loud when you're talking down to struggling moms, Shaq said, his voice low but firm. Where's that energy now? Bradley's fingers twitched toward his phone. I'm not doing this, he muttered, shaking his head. I don't have to explain myself to you people. He turned on his heel, gripping the handle of his car door. Shaq took another step forward. You're walking away? He asked, his tone almost amused. That's funny. You had a whole lot to say when you thought nobody would push back. You thought you were untouchable. Bradley froze but didn't turn around. His fingers curled into a fist at his side. Tell me something, Shaq continued. How much is your pride worth? More than the lives you ruined. Bradley clenched his jaw. This conversation is over. But Shaq wasn't done. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone again. With a few taps, he held the screen toward Bradley, letting the glow illuminate his pale face. Another headline. Another revelation. Federal prosecutors close in on Whitmore Enterprises. Insider claims, more arrests coming. Bradley's breath hitched. His hands balled into fists. Where did you get that? Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he smirked. Bradley's entire body was rigid now, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Then, without another word, he spun around, yanking his phone from his pocket and dialing furiously. Emily narrowed her eyes. Who are you calling? Bradley didn't answer. The gas station fell silent except for the distant hum of the highway. Then, screak! A black SUV sped into the parking lot, tires screeching against the pavement as it came to a sharp halt just feet away. Bradley's smirk returned. He slid his phone into his pocket, straightened his suit, and turned back toward Shaq. "You messed with the wrong guy," he said. The SUV's headlights cast long shadows across the gas station pavement, slicing through the darkness like knives. The doors flung open in unison, and heavy boots struck the concrete with purpose. Shaq didn't move. Bradley, however, took a nervous step back. His smirk faltered for a split second, just long enough to betray the fear bubbling beneath his arrogant exterior. Then came the unmistakable flash of badges. "Bradley Whitmore." A sharp voice cut through the thick tension. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Step away from the vehicle. Now." The air shifted instantly. Emily stiffened. The gas station attendant, who had been pretending not to watch, took a step closer, eyes wide. Even Oliver, still seated in the car, pressed his tiny face against the window, watching the scene unfold with childlike curiosity. Bradley's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Well, what is this?" His hands twitched at his sides. "I don't know what you people think you're doing, but this is a mistake." One of the agents, a tall man with a buzz cut and a no-nonsense expression, didn't blink. "We've been watching you for a long time, Mr. Whitmore. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. Shall I go on?" Bradley's face drained of color. Shaq exhaled, slow and steady, shaking his head. "Ain't it funny how karma works?" His deep voice carried, thick with amusement. Bradley's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape. This isn't right," he spat. "You can't do this to me. I have rights." "You do," the agent said flatly, "and you can exercise them when your lawyer meets you downtown. But for now," he grabbed Bradley's wrist and twisted it behind his back in one swift motion. Bradley yelped, struggling. You're making a mistake. I'm Bradley Whitmore. You can't treat me like some common criminal." The agent secured the cuffs with a metallic snap. "Sir, you are a common criminal." The gas station had gone completely silent. Emily clutched her arms around herself, watching in shock as the man who had once looked down on her was shoved against the hood of his own luxury car. A car that, just moments ago, he had treated like a throne. Now, it was being searched, impounded, stripped of its authority. The FBI agent nearest to Shaq glanced up. "Appreciate the assist," he said casually. Shaq raised a brow. "I didn't do much." The agent smirked. "That's not what our records say." Shaq crossed his arms. "I take it y'all got everything you need?" "Almost." The lead agent nodded to one of his men who handed him a file. He flipped it open, scanning the contents before lifting his gaze back to Shaq. "Actually, we could use some help proving our case." Emily's breath hitched. Bradley, still pinned against the car, thrashed. "You think he can help you? He's just some washed-up basketball player." Shaq exhaled, rubbing his chin. "See, that's your problem, Whitmore. You keep underestimating people." The agent chuckled. "And that's exactly why he's going down." The flashing lights of the FBI vehicles had disappeared down the road, taking Bradley Whitmore with them. But the weight of the moment still hung thick in the air. The gas station was eerily quiet now, except for the soft hum of the streetlights overhead and the occasional passing car. Emily stood frozen beside her rusted sedan, arms wrapped around herself as if shielding from the storm that had just passed. She barely registered the gas station attendant whispering to a customer inside, or the distant sound of Oliver fidgeting in the back seat. Shaq, arms crossed, watched her closely. He could see the disbelief etched into her face, the way her mind was racing to catch up. She turned to him finally, her voice hoarse. How did this even happen?" Shaq let out a slow breath, glancing toward the dark road where the FBI had disappeared. "Because that man thought he was untouchable," he said. "But turns out nobody's above karma." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I mean, the way everything just unraveled. My husband, he worked for him. He lost his job because of that man. And now," she gestured weakly, shaking her head, "now he's in handcuffs?" Shaq studied her for a moment before he spoke. "Your husband wasn't the only one," he said. "Hundreds of people lost their jobs because of him. That's how these guys work. They don't see people, just numbers." She swallowed hard. I never knew." "You weren't supposed to," Shaq said. "People like him, they hide behind fancy offices, legal loopholes, and corporate nonsense. But the truth always comes out." Emily blinked, still trying to process everything. "And you," she hesitated, looking at him fully for the first time. You were willing to step into all this for a stranger? Shaq cracked a small smile. I don't really do stranger, he said. Just people. She let out a breath that sounded half a laugh, half a sob. I don't even know what to say. You don't gotta say anything. A sudden vibration cut through the night air, Shaq's phone buzzing in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen, reading the flood of notifications. His name was already trending. News outlets had picked up the arrest, and now headlines were spreading like wildfire. Big Shaq takes down corrupt CEO in shocking arrest. Former NBA star exposes business tycoon's illegal empire. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. Well, looks like I'm in it now. Emily furrowed her brow. Is that bad? He chuckled. Depends who you ask. Before she could respond, a small voice piped up from behind them. Mr. Shaq? They both turned to see Oliver standing outside the car, his tiny figure illuminated by the gas station's fluorescent lights. He clutched his stuffed dinosaur close, his big eyes staring up at Shaq in pure awe. Shaq crouched down to meet him at eye level. What's up, little man? Oliver hesitated, then asked, Why did you help my mommy? Shaq held his gaze, his expression softening. Because, he said, I just do what's right, little man. Oliver thought about that for a moment before nodding solemnly, as if storing the answer away for later. Shaq smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. Emily wiped at her eyes again, but this time it wasn't from sadness. And as Shaq stood back up, he had the distinct feeling that this night, this moment, was going to change everything. Emily's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she stared at the gas station's flickering neon sign. The events of the past hour felt surreal, like she had stepped into a movie where the villain got what he deserved, but she had no idea what came next. Her heart was still racing, not from fear anymore, but from something else. Uncertainty. She glanced at Shaq, who stood beside her car like a mountain, his presence steady and unshaken. I still don't understand, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Why did you get involved? You didn't have to. Shaq shrugged, his deep voice calm. Didn't have to, just wanted to. Emily let out a shaky laugh, shaking her head. Well, thank you. I mean it. I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here. Shaq nodded, then took a step back. So, what's your plan now? She blinked, caught off guard. My plan? Yeah, Shaq said, leaning against her car door. Bradley's gone. That chapter's over. What's next? Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her plan? She didn't have one. For so long, her focus had been on surviving, making sure Oliver had food, keeping the lights on, taking whatever part-time work she could find just to scrape by. She never had the luxury of thinking ahead. She hesitated, swallowing hard. I don't know. Shaq studied her for a moment, then pulled out his phone. Well, he said, tapping the screen. You do now. Emily's brows furrowed in confusion. What are you? Shaq raised a finger, signaling her to wait as he put the phone to his ear. Yo, he said casually, his voice carrying authority. Yeah, it's me. Listen, I got someone you need to meet. Emily's breath hitched. Who was he calling? There was a pause as the person on the other end responded. Shaq nodded, glancing at Emily. Single mom, smart, hard-working, just got dealt a bad hand. Trust me, you'll want her on your team. Emily's hands curled into fists against her lap. Was this really happening? A deep voice came through the speaker, slightly muffled but firm. If you vouch for her, that's all I need to hear. Shaq grinned. Tell her to come in tomorrow morning. Emily's stomach dropped. Tomorrow? Shaq ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket, looking at her expectantly. She was frozen in place. Wait, what just happened? I got you an interview. Emily's head spun. An interview? With who? Shaq smirked. Let's just say it's a company that actually values people. She shook her head in disbelief. You barely know me. Shaq crossed his arms. Nah, I've seen enough. Emily's throat tightened. She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or both. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She had a chance at something more. The person on the other end of the call said, Tell her to come in tomorrow morning. The towering office building loomed before Emily, its glass panels reflecting the morning sun in dazzling streaks of gold. She clutched her purse tightly, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The air smelled of expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee, a stark contrast to the gas station where her life had changed just hours ago. She still couldn't believe it. Shaq had made a single phone call, and now she was here, standing in the lobby of one of the most prestigious firms in the city, a company she'd never imagined setting foot in, let alone interviewing for. Emily smoothed down her blouse and approached the receptionist. Hi, The woman glanced up, her expression warm. You must be Emily. Mr. Carter is expecting you. Mr. Carter, the CEO. Emily exhaled, nodding as she followed the receptionist down a long corridor lined with frosted glass offices. Her heels clicked, softly against the polished floors, her nerves growing with each step. She needed this job, not just for herself, but for Oliver. This was her chance to finally give him the life he deserved. The receptionist stopped at a sleek wooden door and knocked lightly before pushing it open. Come in, a voice called. Emily stepped inside. Behind an enormous desk sat Mr. Carter, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver-streaked hair and sharp blue eyes. He offered a firm handshake and gestured to the chair across from him. Shaq told me a bit about you, he said with a small smile. He speaks highly of your work ethic. Emily swallowed, trying to steady herself. I appreciate the opportunity, sir. For the next 15 minutes, the interview went smoother than she expected. Mr. Carter asked about her experience, her skills, her goals. Emily answered each question with quiet confidence, feeling her nerves fade as she spoke. He nodded approvingly. You're exactly the kind of person we want here. Emily's chest swelled with hope. This was really happening. Then the door opened. A man strode in, dressed in a tailored suit, his presence commanding the room. Emily's breath hitched. She recognized that face. Sharp jawline, cold blue eyes, the same arrogant smirk as her stomach dropped. Bradley's brother. He stopped mid-step, his gaze locking onto her. His smirk twisted into something ugly. You? His voice dripped with disbelief. Then it hardened. You think you deserve a job here? Emily's fingers dug into her lap. Mr. Carter frowned. Excuse me? The man, James Whitmore, chuckled darkly. I know exactly who she is. He turned to Emily, his expression smug. And I don't care who sent you. You're not getting hired. Emily's world spun. He smirked. I don't care who sent you. You're not getting hired. Shaq sat in his car, one hand drumming against the steering wheel as he glanced at his phone. He had been expecting Emily's call, but when it finally came, the tension in her voice told him everything he needed to know. He didn't even give me a chance, she said, voice tight with frustration. As soon as he saw me, he shut it down. He told me I wasn't getting hired. Shaq exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Who? Emily hesitated. James Whitmore, Bradley's brother. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Man, these Whitmores really don't know when to quit. Emily sighed on the other end. I'm sorry, Shaq. I really thought this was going to work out, but I guess I was stupid for hoping. Shaq's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He didn't like that. The defeat in her voice. The way the Whitmores made people feel small, like they didn't deserve a shot. That was about to change. Sit tight, he said, voice firm. I got this. Emily started to protest, but Shaq had already ended the call. His fingers moved swiftly across his phone screen, dialing a number he rarely had to use. It rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Mr. O'Neill, the man on the other end greeted. To what do I owe the pleasure? Shaq didn't waste time. I need a favor, and I need it now. Inside the high-rise office building, James Whitmore leaned back in his chair, pleased with himself. He had shut down that woman before she could even get comfortable. He didn't care that Shaq had pulled some strings to get her in. The Whitmores weren't about to let some nobody stroll into their world and take opportunities they didn't deserve. His smug satisfaction was interrupted by the sudden ringing of his office phone. His secretary's voice came through the line, panicked. Mr. Whitmore, the board of directors wants to see you. Now, James frowned. What? Why? They wouldn't say. His stomach tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He straightened his tie, grabbed his suit jacket, and made his way to the boardroom, unaware that his entire world was about to implode. Shaq leaned against his car, watching the city skyline as his phone buzzed with a message. It's done, he smiled. That was all he needed to know. James sat frozen in his chair, his face pale as the board members finished speaking. You put the company at risk by making a personal decision based on bias, one of them said, their tone icy. Shaq is one of our biggest investors. Losing him would be catastrophic. Another board member sighed. Effective immediately. You're out. James's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. Security will escort you out, the chairman added, already turning his attention elsewhere. Minutes later, James was walking through the lobby, his face burning as people whispered around him. Karma had come, swift and brutal. Emily sat on a bench outside the office building, still trying to process everything that had happened, when she heard the familiar deep voice behind her. Told you I had you. She turned to see Shaq standing there, his expression calm but proud. Her eyes welled up. I don't even know what to say. Shaq shrugged. Don't need to say nothing. She wiped a tear from her cheek. Why are you doing all this for me? Shaq's answer was simple, but powerful. Because someone once did it for me. Emily, overwhelmed, wipes a tear. Why are you doing all this for me? Shaq's answer. Because someone once did it for me. Emily sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea while Oliver played with his toy cars on the floor. The past few days had felt like a whirlwind. One moment, she was on the verge of losing everything, and the next, Shaq had turned her life around. She had a stable job now, a future for her son, and for the first time in years, she felt safe. But peace, it seemed, was never meant to last. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize flashed across the screen. She hesitated before answering. Hello? The voice on the other end made her blood run cold. Well, well. If it isn't Emily Clark. She gripped the phone tighter. The voice was unmistakable, smooth, arrogant, laced with venom. Bradley Whitmore. Her breath hitched. How are you calling me? A low chuckle crackled through the line. Oh, you'd be surprised what money can buy. Even in here. Emily swallowed hard, glancing at Oliver, who was still happily playing, unaware of the dread settling into his mother's chest. What do you want, Bradley? You think you've won, don't you? His voice dropped, a sinister undertone creeping in. You think Shaq fixed everything? That this is over? She said nothing. Bradley continued, his words slow and deliberate. I still have friends, Emily. People who don't take kindly to what happened to me. People who can make your life miserable. Emily's hands trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, another voice interrupted. A deep, amused voice. You done? Emily blinked. The call was still connected, but she wasn't alone. Shaq? She whispered. Yeah, I'm here, he said casually, like he'd just joined a conference call. Picked up the line when I saw the number. Thought I'd see what our buddy Bradley was up to. There was silence on the other end. Then Bradley's voice returned, dripping with anger. You think you can keep getting in my way, O'Neill? Shaq let out a slow chuckle. Man, you're talking big for someone calling from a prison payphone. Emily could hear Bradley's breathing grow heavy, frustration radiating through the call. Shaq wasn't done. Let me break this down for you, real simple, my guy. You had power. You had money. You used it to screw over good people like Emily and her husband. And now? You don't have anything. You don't know who you're messing with, Shaq. Shaq leaned back, smirking, even though Bradley couldn't see him. Nah, you didn't know who you were messing with. And now look at you, sitting in a cell, throwing threats over a collect call. Silence. Shaq's voice hardened. Here's the deal. You lost. You don't get to crawl back into Emily's life. And if I ever hear you tried, he let the sentence hang, letting Bradley fill in the blanks himself. Emily shivered. She didn't need to see Shaq's face to know he was dead serious. Finally, Bradley exhaled sharply. This isn't over. Shaq chuckled. Yeah, it is. And with that, he ended the call. Emily stared at her phone, her heart still pounding. You think he'll try something? Shaq shook his head, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. That's the last time you'll ever hear from him. Shaq hangs up. That's the last time you'll ever hear from him. Bradley Whitmore sat hunched on the edge of his prison bunk, the dim flickering light casting long shadows against the cold concrete walls. The tiny television mounted in the corner of the communal cell crackled with static before settling on a news broadcast. He barely paid attention at first, his mind clouded with rage and regret. But then he heard the name. Breaking news. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal makes headlines again, this time for helping a struggling single mother get back on her feet while taking down a corrupt CEO in the process. Bradley's jaw clenched as the screen showed Emily, standing tall and confident, shaking hands with the CEO of her new company. The lower third of the screen read, From Struggling to Success, A Mother's Journey After Corporate Betrayal. His stomach twisted. He had tried to bury her, humiliate her. Now she was on national television, her future brighter than ever. The footage shifted, showing Shaq walking out of the company's headquarters, flashing his signature grin at the cameras. Reporters shouted questions at him. "Shaq, how does it feel knowing you changed this woman's life?" He shrugged casually. "Man, I just did what anyone should do. Look out for people who deserve better." Bradley's grip tightened around the metal frame of his cot. His mind raced with all the ways things had spiraled out of his control. His empire, gone. His money, seized. His name, now synonymous with fraud and corporate greed. The next clip showed Oliver, Emily's son, stepping into a prestigious private school, wearing a crisp new uniform. He beamed with excitement, waving at the camera before running inside. Bradley's stomach sank lower. He had spent years clawing his way to the top, stepping on people like Emily without a second thought. And now, he was nothing, forgotten. As the news segment wrapped up, the final shot played. Shaq, leaning against his sleek black SUV, chatting with Emily and Oliver. Oliver turned, grinning ear to ear. "Bye, Mr. Shaq." Shaq smirked, ruffling the kid's hair before opening his car door. "Nah, man, see you around." And with that, he drove off, already on to his next mission. Back in his cell, Bradley's vision blurred with fury. His fate was sealed. No more power, no more control, just four walls and a television broadcasting his own downfall. And the worst part? Shaq never looked back. Shaq grins. "Nah, man, see you around."